Hey, it's me, your best friend, Deacon Jonathan Stewart, back with another Talk Gnosis, the web's premier podcast and YouTube show about Gnosticism, the occult, religion, spirituality, academic religious studies, history, art, poetry, theater, occultism, magic, spirituality, mysticism, the mystical, and anything else we want to talk about. Today, I have a special guest host. We have Jason Mehmel with me. Hello, Jason.
Hello, everybody. Jonathan, I think eventually you're going to make sure that list of things is so long that you'll just, by the time you're finished saying them, the episode will be over.
That is the goal. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and our extra special last minute guest is Clark Aitkins, joining us live from just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Deacon Clark Aitkins. Hello, Clark.
Woo! Yay, hello.
Woot.
What up, y'all?
So we've got a pretty incredible show for y'all tonight. For those who don't know Clark from our Gospel of Mary show, he has an MA from Harvard. He is a Harvard man, and he is a deacon in the AJC, and he is a general, all-around cool dude. Really, don't tell anybody else, because I don't think anybody else from the AJC watches this. I hope they don't, but we've got two of my faves for me tonight. And what we're doing is answering questions from the audience. If you want to ask your questions for future installations of the show, send them to us on Facebook, send them to us on Twitter, email them to me, leave them as questions on YouTube down below. You've got lots of ways to send them in. We'll do our best to answer them. All of our answers are correct. We have the only answers. Anybody else who gives you a different answer is wrong. We have a mix tonight of questions from the audience as well as questions that I made up specifically for Clark and Jason. I will send you a free autographed copy of Tony Sylvia's book if you can tell me which are which.
Oh, God.
Okay, before we get into it and give you the good stuff, we have a little bit of the bad stuff. Actually, it's great stuff too. We need money. Specifically, I need money. Give us money, please, if you can. I know that these are hard times, but if you can spare even $1 per month, we actually do have to pay our 99 Perspectives, the world's greatest, best, most superior, most supreme digital studio. If you want to start a YouTube show or a podcast, you should also hire them. I think they are passing a law that you do have to have your own YouTube show soon, so you should get in touch with 99 Perspectives. They're the best, and there are also other incidental costs, and everybody who works on the show is extremely broke. So if you can help us spread the light of Gnosis, please do by going to patreon.com/Gnostic. For a little, again, as $1 per month, you can help us get the show out. We also want to do more blogging. We hope to start more shows. We've got big plans. We need your help to do so. What you get in return, because if you know the drill, you probably listen to a lot of podcasts, watch a lot of YouTube shows. Everybody's asking you for your money. They give you something more than the show in return. We give you the show up to a week early. And if you are a patron, then you get into either Gnostic Heaven or you get to be reincarnated as the being of your choice. So these are great perks. Don't miss out on them. Okay, now that the homework is done, here I am, Deacon John Stewart, in an attic in rural Nova Scotia. We've got Jason out in Calgary, Alberta. We have Deacon Clark out in somewheres in Massachusetts. Where are you actually, Clark? If anybody wants to come and murder
Dorchester. Yeah, great. They're good luck to them. I'm in Dorchester, which is a part of Boston.
Okay, fantastic. There we go. And I'm happy that... Oh, and Jerome is in Chicago. So we are bringing the entire continent together. Okay, here we go. A question that's totally from a listener and not from me, that's not tailored to you two. This hypothetical asker, I'm not down with the Jesus and Jesus-y stuff. Can I still be a Gnostic? And that's from Guy Incognito.
Guy Incognito.
That's right.
Excellent.
Thank you, Guy.
I say, of course, yeah, I am. I'm not a Jesus-y type, and I'm a Gnostic. I don't think Jesus is required for it. Not for the modern movement. I don't see why it would be. I have a thing about the Christ idea and the Logos idea. I think something like that might be important, but the historical person Jesus is, I don't think, is a prerequisite.
Right. Jason, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think like it's something that the more actually my involvement with the AJC has helped me get more into Jesus-y stuff. But it's still like I still find that I can't engage with it quite maybe as easily or as immersively, I think, as a lot of my compatriots. Like it's like I need to take a few more extra steps to get as involved. I think like the more I see it, and this might be heretical, but the more I specifically try to see it as a story and a series of stories that have been told rather than a history, I think the more I see it narratively, the more that helps.
Right.
But I think the even seeing it as a story is that I feel like I'm sometimes about like 1,500 years behind everyone else's readings, if that makes sense.
Okay. Actually, could you elaborate on being 1,500 years behind?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too.
Yeah.
Like that. So, so for example, like John and I are in a lodge chat, and there'll be a lot of stuff going back and forth about various like scriptures or people from whichever book of the Bible or commentaries and things like that. That I'm like, I am hanging on by my fingernails to glean the context, or even sometimes like say in the AJC Facebook chat or like a conversation where people will be like, oh, I found this cool, biblical history post, and I think it's neat how they made this context, but I disagree with them on this point. And I'm like, holy crap, I haven't done my homework, because it's like, if you look at it as a body of literature, then you've got people who are responding to people who've been responding to people who've been responding to people for 1,000 years. And so when I say 1,500 years, it's like I feel like I kind of know the Bible stories because I grew up Lutheran, and like my mom, when I was getting bored in sermons, my mom gave me this like picture book of the Bible. So I feel like I've read the whole Bible, at least in terms of context, but not not like the actual, not any particular translation. But that like I am not familiar, or like I'm not deeply I haven't memorized the theological points of the last say 1,500 years since like some of those major scriptures were sort of made canon, as it were. So I guess that's kind of what I mean. Like I feel like I know those early Bible stories. I know a little bit about the fact that the King James was sort of this like amalgamation or concretization of what we now know as the Bible, but I know more about Star Wars than I know about the Bible.
Well, I think the myth that you bring to it is what's important to you, right? And I think you're going to find a lot of people who can relate to you through specifically Star Wars and Star Trek and all that hippy dippy nonsense. I will. A thing I wanted to address real quick, the sort of I feel it as anxiety. I think maybe that's what you're getting around to, the sense of anxiety when people start talking about this historical background and the theological background. I have a master's degree in this stuff, and I oftentimes find myself gripping the arms of my chair because I don't know what the hell everybody's talking about because I've not read all of the things. But the thing is, we're talking of just Christian history, 2,000 years of history, stories, philosophy, all of it. Multiple communities that came about at different historical time periods. And they all have something different to say. Nobody's an expert on it. And if they try to pass themselves off as such, they're full of shit. But more importantly than that, Christian theology, of course, predates Christianity because it's based on old Greek philosophy. So you've got more than 2,000 years of stuff that you need to bring into it.
Oh, thanks. You just added to the reading list and anxiety there.
Right. I understand. But what I'm saying is, look, man, you can't know all of it. My approach to it is when I'm not feeling the anxiety, which I get oftentimes, when I'm not feeling it too much, I just go along for the ride and try to read and ask questions and learn more about it and just go from there. Because honestly, that's what all the academics are doing anyway. That's what their job is. That's what they do.
Yeah, I feel like actually there's a couple of things. Like when you were saying like you shouldn't feel like you have the handle on it because it's so big that no one should. It reminds me of I think Einstein said like anybody who says they understand quantum physics is lying.
Yeah.
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 You know, and
And
there's
anybody who
maybe
understands Christian history is lying. Yes.
exactly, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and they're both ineffable. Huh?
Yeah.
Huh?
Well.
I'm not going for the secret here, but like, you know, but it's
Right on.
interesting. What was I? There was the other thing I was going to mention too. Oh yeah, like just what you were saying there about the notion of like just sort of being along for the ride. And I find like there are breadcrumbs that I'm willing to chase and bits of interest where I'm like, okay,
Yep.
that's interesting to me, and I'm going to read more. And then there's other bits where I'm like, okay, these guys are arguing about something that means a lot to them, but I don't have enough interest or context to engage, and I don't have the energy to gain that context. So I'm going to let them have their conversation. Like,
Right. Oh, yeah,
this is
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, this is actually often the thing with John and in our lodge chat is that he's going off on a conversation sometimes, and I'll be like, I'll come back in when I'm ready, you know, like I'll just let them go. And you know, I kind of know what's happening, but I don't need to know all of it.
Yeah.
There's also one other thing, like talking about it. Like, so I've got this book by Paul Auster, who's a novelist I love. And in it somewhere, I need to track this down, and maybe if I find it, we can put it in the show notes or something, is he talked about Judaism as a religion of literary criticism.
Yeah, and I've heard similar things about that before too.
Yeah.
A rabbi I once knew said that Judaism is about its books. It's a religion about its books, and its books about its books. You know, into eternity. Yeah. Makes sense.
Isn't there like there's a Muslim saying, isn't or concept too, of like that everybody from like Judaism to Muslims are people of the book?
Yes, that's correct. And there are one or two other groups that they include in that. It's a bit of a mystery as to who they're referring to. But Christianity, of course, its history follows pretty closely the development of the modern book from the Codex. And a recent historian I just listened to giving YouTube lectures about 2 months ago, and I can't remember his name. He's an important historian. I'm a great historian myself. I remember names and dates really good. And he initially, I mean, his one of his points was that the history of early Christianity is the history of the development of what we would now call the book from the concept of the Codex. They're not exactly the same thing. They're closely related, and it was Christianity's adaptation of the book in this new form of media that led to its success. One of the reasons it was such a success. That's a speculation, which I tend to lean towards. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's probably really encouraging, bringing it back to the initial question, for some Gnostics out there. And, you know, the dominant forms of Gnosticism that are the largest right now are Christian Gnosticism. And the dominant forms of by far. And then the dominant form of Gnostic texts we have are Christian Gnostic texts. So you do have to grapple with the Christian tradition in some way. But I think there's a lot of people out there who are probably kind of relieved, to be honest, who are like, oh, geez, I've been curious about this stuff and I don't have to do the Jesus stuff. These two guys ain't doing the Jesus stuff. And Jason, when you talk about, you know, I'll go on these rants and go in these rabbit holes and these things you don't understand about Christian history in the chat, you know, two things on that, which is that the Gnostic tradition is a diamond with many faces. So there's going to be things where you talk about, you know, narrative or Jung or other aspects that I see as part of the Gnostic tradition, which I'm not going to know as much about. That's going to be everybody, right? Because just like Clark was saying, anybody who tells you they know everything about Christian history is a liar. It's the same thing with Gnosticism, right? If they say, I am the master of Gnosticism, I know everything about the tradition for the last 2,000 years, well, you don't. It's impossible. So, you know, you will have the things within this very incredibly broad tradition, which was set up as a broad tradition. Like the Secret Book of John, when we're talking about books and commentaries on books and books about books, is one of the first postmodern meta texts. This ancient Gnostic text is very modern because it's commentary on so many things, and you could just spend the rest of your life trying to understand that one text because it comments on Aristotelian theater structure. Jason, it comments on the Roman Empire. It comments on Christianity. It comments on a whole bunch of texts. And that is just, you know, one 30-page text. And you will never be able to master just it. So, and the final thing I will say when talking about the the line that, Judaism is commentary on text. I normally, right now I'm in an attic in the middle of nowhere. Normally I live in a Hasidic neighborhood, and I'm surrounded by people who literally do nothing but read Torah all day. Okay, so I struggle to understand how you could do this 8 hours a day, for 40, 50, 60 years. And then I've been reading a lot of Kabbalah lately, and the Hasidic tradition does draw from Kabbalah. And I found out that there's at least 10 different ways in the Kabbalistic system to understand the first 5 words in Genesis. So I can see how you can spend the rest of your life just on Torah / the Hebrew Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I better move on. That was really awesome, guys, and I think there's a lot of people out there whose hearts just flutter when they're like, and I love the Jesus stuff, by the way. He's my dude. I started off as a Christian and I came into this, and all those people out there, if Jesus is your dude, come on into Christian Gnosticism. If he's not your dude, hey, you have a front seat as well.
Right. I mean, I have a master's degree in early Christianity, and the most annoying thing that I had to study for that degree is the historical Jesus. Seriously, I don't care about it.
Well, and I think it's also like, in case anyone's listening to this that hasn't heard me talk about this before, which they probably haven't, is that like I initially came into Gnosticism through Dungeons and Dragons. Like a friend of mine, a friend of mine who was a history major and an atheist ran a D&D game where he built a D&D campaign in real world Italy in the like 1500s or maybe it was earlier than that, like maybe like around the year thousands or so, and like the Byzantine Empire was still a thing, and and he his whole, like, basically the rabbit hole we went down was, I made a magic user, and the whole concept is that I had to give him a reason why I could use magic, and I'm like, I was already kind of aware of a little bit of the occult stuff through like the comics that I'd been consuming and stuff, and that some of the writers that I'd been enjoying, and so I was like, well, okay, maybe it's all about language, and I was really into burrows and stuff like that. So like language is controlling the universe and stuff, and so then he jumped on that, went back to his history papers, found the Nag Hammadi Codex, which he'd taken in a history class, and started referencing it in the game. And then I was like, what is this? And he's like, oh, it's this Nag Hammadi thing. There were these Gnostics from back whenever, this was their whole background. And I was like so fascinated that I followed up on it, basically. And that's what led me here, but I keep kind of going like, where are the weird like monsters and all that kind of stuff. Because I came to it.
Nag Hammadi is full of weird monsters, man.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But when I found the AJC, I'm like, nobody.
Oh, there's the weird monsters. Yeah,
yeah,
well, let's show the AJC full weird monsters.
Yeah, there's full of them too.
Yeah.
Very true.
But yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I think maybe the capstone to that simply is maybe just me saying that if anyone is finding themselves interested in Gnosticism, there are definitely ways to engage with it that don't require it to be a Christian or even like theologically specific background.
Yes. 100%. Okay, so moving on from that and reassuring everybody that you don't have to be a Christian, we have the question actually from a listener, viewer, from Osmond Sparebot _3K. So awesome username.
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
mm-hmm.
And they have a question specifically about an important part of Christian symbolism, which is, I am curious on hot takes on the relevance or symbolism that the character of Mother Mary / the Virgin Mary might have on Gnostic thought. Anybody?
On the influence that Mary has on Gnostic thought?
I
Mother
think
Mary.
Yeah, Mother Mary. I think they're basically saying, does the Virgin Mary have any role in Gnosticism?
I mean, it can if you bring it, because Gnosis is personal, I think.
Yeah.
That said, I'm hard-pressed to think of any text that you could point to and say that the Virgin Mary or Jesus' mom is here, except possibly the Gospel of Mary. There is this minor debate off to the side about which Mary wrote the Gospel of Mary. It's generally accepted that it was Magdalene, but some people hold out that it was Jesus' mom. I don't think that's not widely accepted, though. It's just a possibility.
Yeah. I mean, like, purely in the realm of hot takes, and this was actually something I warned John about, is that, like, based on my scriptural knowledge, anything I talk about is basically a hot take. But what was I going to mention? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Is that there is the fact that maybe Sophia is a virgin mother in a way. When you look at the Valentinian model, you've got, so like there is maybe that as above so below kind of thing. You've got a virgin mother who is helping create everything, and then another virgin mother who creates an instantiation of the ineffable that can kind of get through the muck to point us upwards, kind of thing. Again, hot take rambling, but
it's a hot take that I think is exactly right, and I usually trot that one out at Christmas, where Sophia, like, I do actually think that Gnosticism is pre-Christian, which is now controversial, even though it's obvious. Sorry, scholars, but it does adapt to Christian mythology when it comes along, and that's just it. Is they are taking the idea of Sophia the Virgin from the ideas of the virgin birth that were floating around. Now, I'm not saying that
Sophia predates Mary for sure. The idea of Sophia
100%.
predates Mary, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, but when Christianity and Gnosticism meet and combine, they do take influences and they go back and forth. So some of the Mary story gets imprinted back onto the Sophia story. Now, I'm not saying that the early Gnostics thought that Mary was an incarnation of Sophia. We don't really have any evidence for that, but we do have the idea of in Gnostic texts, what you have is as above, so below, an interesting satirical parallel. So you have the Virgin Sophia giving birth by herself to the demiurge, right, which screws everything up. So then you need the Virgin Mary to give birth to Jesus, who fixes everything. Now this is a deliberate parallel, right? So yeah, you should trot that one out at Christmas. So yeah, there definitely are connections between the figures. Now, the Gnostics of the 1800s, of where we get our lineages from, they did what we sometimes call the waving of the Gnostic wand. So they would take all these things that were dedicated to Mother Mary and to Mary Magdalene. They'd wave the wand and say, these are now about Sophia. Yeah, and there's some good things about that, and there's some very bad things about that. And I know that the modern AJC has kind of struggled with that, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the church, but I know within the last couple of years they did introduce a special holiday for Mother Mary in January, because we are using partly a liturgical calendar that we inherited from those Gnostics in the 1800s, and all the Mother Mary holidays became Sophia holidays. So there definitely are connections between the figures. Now, are they ancient connections? A little bit. Did modern Gnostics go hog wild of understanding Mother Mary as Sophia? 100%. Is that right or wrong? It's up to you.
I think I would say that I think that the ancient Gnostics were more concerned about Mary making the Magdalene more of a Sophia figure than the Mother Mary. But that's just my hot take.
Well, we've got a question next, actually, from a listener. So interesting that you bring that up, because here's the next question: are Sophia and Mary Magdalene the same person? From Ledoux 98.
So historically, no, they're not historically the same person. So Sophia is a concept that predates Mary Magdalene as an individual by a long while. And I mean, there are some reasons to think that Mary Magdalene was a real person. Not as many as there are to think that Jesus was an historical person, but there are some that are there. So it makes sense to accept it. But Sophia was around before that, and you can find references to her in all kinds of sources long before JC came around.
From a not historical but literary analysis standpoint, I would say yes. Or at least sure.
I mean, you can make that equivalent if you want to. One can be symbolic of the other, for sure. I agree.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Like, I think if that's something, like, maybe a cheesy way to say it is that if that's something that you want to light a candle to, do it.
Exactly.
Or meditate on, or find impact. Like, find a sort of a personal narrative impact on. Yeah,
it works.
There are a lot of details about the relationship between Jesus and the Magdalene that I think fit in very well with the syzygy concept. The dynamic between these two personalities and how they are a balance for each other. One male, one female. This is a very old gender concept, but it's there in the text, and I think that it does fit. But but Sophia and Mary are not historically the same thing.
No.
The other thing is, this is a rant. Sorry, Jason. It is a rabbit hole that you may or may not be familiar with. But I wanted to bounce off Clark because he is sort of the Mary Magdalene expert. I have a theory, Clark. So that Mary Magdalene, you will hear a lot of scholars, particularly around Easter, when Jesus stuff is in the news a lot, that they will talk about how the idea that Mary Magdalene was a sex worker is actually an idea that comes from the 4th or 5th century and is a slurring of her. Right? It's something
that's historically recorded. Yes.
Yes, exactly. However, I would also say to that, when people trot that out, often many progressive feminist scholars trot this out. But I'm like, oh, so does that mean being a sex worker is a bad thing? But that's a different discussion. That conflation between Mary Magdalene being a sex worker might actually come from Gnosticism, because we have in the text, for instance, Thunder Perfect Mind, but in some other texts as well, where the lower aspect of Sophia is called a prostitute. A sex worker, and within the text. Okay, and then the other thing that we have as well from Gnosticism is there's a teacher who shows up in the Bible, Simon. And Simon was one of the first important Gnostics around the time of Jesus, known as Simon the Magus. He's in the book of Acts, but there's a whole bunch of Gnostic literature, most of it lost, but we have some remnants of it, mostly for the heresiologists. He seems to have been a contemporary of Jesus and Paul, and what he did was he thought that Sophia had been incarnated into the body of a sex worker named Helen. And he went and rescued Helen from a brothel. So here we have, and some people seem to believe that there's a connection between Simon and Jesus, that perhaps Simon was the second coming of Jesus. So here we have a Jesus-like divine figure who has a companion who's a sex worker, who's the incarnation of Sophia. So I could see how this gets back put onto Mary Magdalene later, like how these two figures of Helen and Mary Magdalene are mixed up.
So the thing that I have to say about that is there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. But I think the notion here isn't that the female figure, the female character in these stories is that they're a sex worker per se. It's that they're sexually active women who are independent of men.
Yeah.
Within the context of their time. So this Helen, of course, that you talked about, you can see echoes of her in Helen of Troy.
I was just going to say,
a sexually independent woman, but we're talking centuries later, so the cultural context is going to be different. So the Sophia story has got to tweak itself out to fit those people in that time and place, which I find to be like divine genius. Another idea, sometimes you see the notion that Mary Magdalene is a sex worker because of the woman at the well, and one of the texts, I forget which one it is, Jesus comes to the woman in the well, and she's been married 5 times, and blah, 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 and she's clearly very promiscuous, which is unacceptable at the time, or seems to be unacceptable at the time. It doesn't necessarily say that she's a sex worker, and there's nothing in the Bible that says that this is Mary Magdalene. That's a conflation that we assume. They're two very different women. And of course, you have to take into context that at the time, I don't know how it was exactly in Jesus's day, but the centuries that predated Jesus, the ancient Israelites, sex worker wasn't necessarily the worst thing to be. In fact, it was considered to be an actual legitimate option for women to live independently of men. So tavern workers and sex workers, prostitutes, were the sort of thing that a woman could be if she didn't want to be married. And we see echoes of that in the Solomon story with the slicing the baby in half or threatening to do so, etc., etc. Those women lived in the middle of their culture, and nobody hassled them for being prostitutes. But I haven't read that story in a while, so maybe I'm getting the details wrong. But so prostitution and women who are sexually free, like there is a long, complicated story here, and it doesn't necessarily mean that a woman who is sexually free is specifically a prostitute.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Very. No, that's great. This is
I had
the
to
show.
dig into my head to get all that out. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the rant show. So Gnosis in general is the rant show, but particularly the answering of viewer questions. And actually, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because we do have a lot of questions on the sheet, and I wanted to get to one from Lux01, who is a loyal listener and a really awesome person who is active on the Reddit slash our Gnostic subreddit. Everybody watching should check that out and engage there. So Lux01 asks, what are your thoughts on the Ascension rituals practiced by certain ancient Gnostic groups, most notably the Sephians, and what kind of place might they have in modern Gnosticism?
It's too bad Tony's not here.
I was just going to say, I'm like, well, maybe we might want to park that question, because I think there's even some possible Tony shows in the offing. That I would like, because that would almost be a thing. Like that could be a whole show.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I wanted to get to that one both because it does strike home to Talk Gnosis and because Lux01 is so rad. But I guess what we can say is the founder of Talk Gnosis was working on an Ascension project. And it is something that is incredibly important both for the ancient Gnostics and I would say for the modern Gnostics. And I think an emphasis that many Gnostics out there want to come back to. Now, for those not in the know, the idea is that you ascend, the idea being that we are kind of stuck here in the Demiurgus universe. While you're still alive, you have an ascent to the true reality, to the pleroma, to the true God, which is because of the Gnosis you've already experienced. And this ascent then impacts upon you what might be known as enlightenment or true union with God or becoming one with the pleroma. So this seems to be a very important thing. And it seems to be incredibly important to the ancient Gnostics. It does pop up in other systems. It does pop up in other cultures. It does pop up in other occult streams. But the problem is the specific Gnostic ascent has been mostly lost to us. What did they do to ascend? Right. What was the ritual? What was the meditation? What was the words? What did they? Right. How did they do it?
I mean, the Gospel of Philip seems to be about that sort of thing. It seems to be very focused on a baptismal ritual. We have a lot of hints about soul ascent rituals. Some of the details that were very specific to the different religious communities. I've been reading a lot about this stuff because the second half of the Gospel of Mary is clearly about a soul ascent. Whether it's pre or post mortem, we don't really know. And the influences that come in from outside, I mean, everybody had some sort of soul ascent at the time. It was an ancient idea. It goes back thousands of years before Gnosticism, or hundreds of years before Gnosticism came around, for thousands of years from us. And probably
you find it in shamanism. Like, it's everywhere.
Well, so I would be very careful about drawing those sorts of parallels. Yes, you can find a sort of a soul ascent going on there. I don't know enough about shamanism. I'm very worried about bringing shamanism into everything because it's a bit of a fad, in the same way that it's a fad to bring Gnosticism into everything. So I mean, that there are crossovers and parallels is undeniable.
Well,
but I'm not going to assume that every single shamanistic culture has in mind what we have in mind. I think that's an important thing, right?
I'm going to go the other way and be Mr. Hot Take over here. But say actually, like, to go the other way around is that, like, I see, kind of in that Joseph Campbellian mode where, like, like all of these stories are pointing back to an story or a golden vein of something. And I know there's bristling happening in the air here.
Sorry. It's nothing personal, but yeah.
No. But because for me, this is also an artistic thing. Is that, like, I think
I see. Yes.
Part of how my own approach for a lot of this is that it is this attempt to try to connect with something that is ineffable, and that we are looking at, like, historical and textual instantiations of many different cultures' attempts to describe an ineffable thing, and there may be a unity of connection there, but it will only ever be different in its manifestations. But so like, to all of this to say is that, like, I can imagine I can make all kinds of connections that make sense, that I think you could make a literary case for as like why shamanism, like literally, like, how many different religions had their gods at the tops of mountains, like, and when you're defining your faith around things that are maybe around you, above you, distant from you, like that, there's I can start to see why, like, the idea of an ascent being something good. Heck, there's also maybe just like this loose idea that I have that, like, often climbing up higher allows you to see further, and therefore you are now more wise of your surroundings, literally. You know, and then so then you take that concept and expand it psychologically. You know, the idea of trying to like see a problem from multiple sides is like sort of an imaginative way of climbing a tree on the problem. You know,
Jason, do you know about the Kenite hypothesis?
I do not, but I'm fascinated.
The Kenite hypothesis is the notion that the ancient Israelite god is an old form of a mountain god. I'll send you a paper that I wrote about it a long time ago if you send me an email. So it's not considered to be proven, but every once in a while, very interesting bits of evidence come along that scholars like to slide into it, like to fit into it. We have both biblical evidence for it, going all the way back to Moses, and where Moses got his ideas from his father-in-law, Jethro, I think was his father-in-law's name.
That's right. Yep.
And then like all of these extra temples that we're finding, these extra ancient Israelite temples that we're finding outside of Jerusalem that weren't supposed to exist, that it ties in very close with the concept of that Jehovah had an Asherah, had a partner, a marriage partner or something like that. So all these things it's fascinating stuff, and nobody's kicked it out of academia yet, but nobody considers it to be proven, and it doesn't really come up in conversation enough. So I'll see if I can find that paper for you and send it to you, and then you can go hog wild on all of those sources.
Sweet.
Yeah, I think you'll do it.
Yeah. I think too that for Gnostic ascent, something that I'm sure other cultures are doing this as well, because as Clark said, you find it all over the place. But of course, it's the Gnostic version, right? And I think for them, it was both in this body, right here and right now, and perhaps for other cultures, it wasn't. They were more concerned about ascending after you die. And for the Gnostics, it was also after death, right? Because once you ascend in life, you're able to ascend after you die. And for the shamanism thing, yeah, you're right. And shamanism is also a very slippery term. But I do think that there is this sort of feeding into Gnosticism from a whole bunch of different cultures that do have ascent ideas. And then the Gnostics are not just taking them and being like, we're borrowing this, we're done. They're, as they love to do, Gnosticizing it, right? So that's why I always say Gnostic ascent. But basically Luxo 1 asked us to go off. And we did go off. So basically asking for hot takes if I'm reading their question right. So
I think that we should let this individual also know that there are people working on trying to recreate these rituals. Like it's not like there are modern Gnostics who are trying to recreate somehow something that will be relevant to the modern world. But the hints are vague. They're vague.
Yes, they are.
That's actually kind of a question I have. Like, because this is my sort of almost more contrarian side of me that like questions the amount of energy we put into dusting off a lot of this old stuff. Is that like even if we found a complete like a Gnostic ascent ritual from just pre-Christian or like a few years after Christ time period, would it make any sense to us? Like, would we be reading a ritual that has a ton of context we simply don't have, and that and again like that, or to get that context you now have to like essentially get your doctorate in the period in that period so that you can do the ritual in a way that has any impact, versus I think what you just said about like trying making it modern or adapting it for modern use. Because I think that's I think to me it would be of such limited use is to try to do a historical recreation, like a sort of a museum piece version of the ritual, because it would only be interesting from an archaeological perspective to me.
Well, so one of the main reasons I'm into the Gospel of Mary is because her soul ascent is not just that it's simple and easy to understand on the surface, because the names of the powers are very relatable, but because they're so relatable, you can bring them into the modern world, into the modern practitioner. They're so, in a way, they're a little bit vague, but in a way, they kind of like fit everybody's human experience, like darkness, wrath, ignorance. These are all things we all have to deal with at any time period. So I think it would be a bit more than an archaeological interest if we found a ritual that was laid out. And despite the fact that there's no way we're going to fully understand the historical and social context. That's one of the things you have to understand about like early Christian studies is we've given up trying to understand fully the historical context of things. We've accepted the fact that we're never going to be able to do that. And so these texts are always going to have a large amount of mystery around them. But I think for us as non-historian practitioners, the point is to bring them up to date. And a lot of people
we would have to
like,
bring them up
they
to
come here
date.
for that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, next question from Infinite Meaning. Maybe we can be the first people excommunicated from the AJC. We'll give it a try. The vast majority of historians. Yeah. Okay. The vast majority of historians do not think that the Templars were Gnostic. Should Templarism in any form be left out of modern Gnosticism?
Well, why? Why would you leave it out?
Exactly.
Well, I can be the contrarian here. Maybe I'll be the one getting excommunicated. I think like there's how do I put this? Like there are interpretations of things that can be that can render something more useful or more engaging than you thought of it before. Like, so once somebody goes, let me give you a different perspective on this, all of a sudden you get a like a much meatier exploration, and you're like, okay, now I get it. But then the flip side is that there are some things that carry so much baggage with them that you're going to spend more time explaining why they shouldn't discount it than you would engaging with why it's useful. And like, to me, the Templars are one of those things where like I am like, I think like the mystery of the Templars has given it such life for narrative, which I think is great, but that it's been so used and so engaged with that that unless you're willing to kind of dig deep and gain as a rich interpretation, you're either going to go with whatever movie version you've heard of, which usually makes them the bad guys, or the source of conspiracies, which like, so like all of those things make it so fraught. Like, I don't know if I would say kick it out, but I would maybe say like leave it in the background, like leave it as a thing that it's like, and I mean also too, like again, hot take here. I think the AJC kind of does leave it out. Like they don't, it doesn't advertise itself as like it's not the first thing you hear is that we are like a continuance of the Templars. At least it's not the first thing I heard.
I think it's like mentioned in passing in some places, but it's not like who we are at all. Exactly. And you're right. It has invited some unwelcome attention from conspiracy people, for sure.
They love the Templars.
I'm not a Templar. Yeah, I'm not a Templar dude, and they're slightly interesting. I went through a phase back in the like late '90s where I thought the Templars were interesting, but I was also into chaos magic at the same time. So I've come a far way. So. I don't know.
The Templars feel like a Rorschach blot in a way. Like, everyone sees in them what they want to see because there's a mystery there. Because
that's a good point. Yeah. I think the romance around the story attracts different types of people, and some of those people are good people.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, 100%. And there is all kinds of like, I'm imagining a particular listener bristling at a lot of what I'm saying here. But I to that person I will say who I think I know pretty well, that like I also acknowledge that there is a lot of information out there and history and research that leads to a richer understanding of a very positive usage of that. That it's just like, unfortunately, you have to get past the fact that there's a Dan Brown novel out there,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Jason, I feel like we might be hearing from a certain individual that you are referring to in the group lodge chat, who in detail will comment on this question from Infinite Meaning. But of course, that particular individual is quite the expert in Templarism. I'll give my answer, which is, should it be left out of modern Gnosticism? No. And I started off not as a Templar guy, and they've been sort of grabbing me the last couple of years. And the vast majority of historians don't think they were Gnostic, but I have found very interesting hints that maybe they were, and even if they're not, when we talk about the story, and the Jason and Clark and I are big, we love the story, the narrative,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
bursting out
We're
of the
definitely
collective
not
unconscious.
postmodern. We like the big overarching narrative for sure. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that narrative I've discovered actually pops up. I thought it was more of a modern thing or a 1700s thing, but it pops up pretty quick after the Templars, because the Templars appear in the Grail mythos. Almost immediately after they're gone. So
Mhm.
they become the template for the Grail Knights. So there
Right.
is right away the myth and the magic of the Templars. If they weren't Gnostic, within a couple of years of them being gone, they are, and then it becomes
Yeah.
very important in the 1700s. And then the other thing that I like is when I say Templars, we often think of the Templars of 1,000 years ago, but actually there's cool Templar revival stuff, which I think is worth looking back
Yes.
at. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
So the Templars, who perhaps there's not a direct continuity, but the people who decided they were Templars in the 1700s and the 1800s did some cool things.
And
And then
that makes me think of the AJC lineage, where we talk
yeah,
about our apostolic lineage. It's considered goal. It's not considered to necessarily be historically factual.
yeah.
The
Mhm.
spiritual connection. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and then those Templars of Palaprat, they did some pretty neat things. So they wrote in that when it comes to Christ, you can make up your own mind. That's pretty progressive for the 1800s. They might have ordained women. That's pretty progressive for the 1800s. I said almost, but there's basically no Christian churches doing any ordination of women, even back at the beginning of the
Right.
1800s. So
Well,
I think
they certainly wanted to, whether they did or not. They certainly wanted to. They were
Mhm.
specifically open to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is cool stuff there. So if I'm looking for, and by the way, the three of us do not speak on behalf of the Apostolic Johannite Church. We're just
Right.
three guys with big opinions.
Yeah.
So I guess if I was going to answer the question, should Templarism be thrown out of modern Gnosticism? No. But I will agree with Jason, and perhaps some people asking these questions and some critics. If it's not for you, just leave it. Throw it out, right? You
Like,
don't need it. And if it is for you, you do have to be a little bit careful, right?
yeah.
Because of a whole bunch of different reasons, some of which we touched on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't need to be into the Templars to be a Gnostic. You don't
Right.
need to be a Gnostic to be into the Templars either.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Um,
But,
one thing,
but you do need to be into the Illuminati. We all know that's real.
Yes,
yes,
our
of
bosses.
course.
So
Of course.
please send us.
Winking
I'm waiting for
emoticons,
I'm waiting for that
emoticon.
Illuminati check.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
they've been a little slow this month. So
One thing I did want to just mention here too, and again, this goes back to like my narrative take or literary take too, is that you were saying like whether or not the Templars were Gnostic, like whether or not they were historically Gnostic versus whether or not what they were practicing was Gnostic in genre, if that makes sense. Because that's often like I mean, and when I look at it that way, I can look at a lot of spiritual traditions that would not define themselves as Gnostic and have no connection scripturally or historically or even geographically, but that I can choose to see as Gnostic in intent, even if they didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, 100% it does. Yes.
I mean, they fill a spot that we're always going to need in our history and in our culture. They fill a slot, and that's always going to be there.
I heard someone say, I think it was again our Templar friend, that like that a lot of people realize like for them they don't discover Gnosticism and say this is a new thing that I now appreciate. It's usually been a way of recognizing something that they already felt. It's a remembering.
I hear that
it's a remembering,
too.
not a not a new thing, a new thing to get into. And like that's for me, I think like the reason I'm involved in Gnosticism is that it's the description of Gnosis is the closest I've ever felt to a description of what happens to me when I make art, or when I'm in a particularly spiritual place, and so then I'm like, okay, well, this is one of the few places that's doing that. I had a point and then I lost my train of thought, but yeah, just vaguely in that realm of like that there is Gnosis, the experience, and then there's Gnosticism, the genre, and then Gnosticism, the history.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
the history.
Yeah.
Okay, a question from Come As You Are. Do Gnostics believe in the physical death and resurrection of Christ?
Well, arguably, this is the whole reason Gnostics are even popular, like historically.
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways to read this question, but yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
the physical death and the physical death, early Christian Gnostics, I mean, it's in their texts. If they weren't Docetists, they still believed in the Docetists still believed in the physical death, but not the physical resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have that right? Yes, that's right. So, Gnostics nowadays, we already posited at the beginning of this episode, if you're not a Jesus dude, you don't have to believe in the physical death and resurrection of Jesus. So no, so I think overall, historically, no, Gnostics don't have to believe in that, though they can. The option is there.
I think that's it. It's historically for a lot of Gnostics, no, and that's right up to the 1800s with the Gnostic revival. A lot didn't seem to, and you're Clark, you're right. Where a lot of the early Gnostics, they were either Docetists or adoptionists, and they may have believed that somehow Christ was crucified, but that Christ might have been an illusion or a ghost, or the spirit that is the Christ essence actually left Jesus's body upon the crucifixion, and what the disciples saw at the resurrection was in fact, that spirit which had already pieced out, coming for a visit. So a lot of times in Gnostic history, the physical death and resurrection of Christ, it's more or less a no. But again, there's many different schools of Gnosticism. Modern Gnosticism is very diverse. To use again, we're all in the AJC. We don't claim to be, the only Gnostics, and we know that we have an audience out there who are not just AJCers. But within the AJC, they don't require you to believe in the physical death and resurrection of Christ. So some of our fellow clergy churchgoers do, some of them don't. And I think that goes for many Gnostics. So do Gnostics believe in the physical death and resurrection of Christ? A complicated question.
Well,
I would complicate it further by pointing out that not necessarily Christians necessarily believe in that. So the earliest Jesus followers, the Ebionites, probably did not believe that Jesus was all of that. They just thought he was a really smart dude. They didn't think he was particularly divine and resurrected.
Exactly.
I think you even kind of see in those bits of history that I am aware of is that there is like part of what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to say like stop focusing on this resurrection stuff because it means you're actually not reading the Sermon on the Mount or like some of these other wisdom things. Like you're I think I read an article years ago. I think it was again one of those things I read it after I discovered Gnosticism. Like I read it the second time after that, and I was like, oh, this is actually about Gnosticism. But it was like something about Jesus without superpowers is what they described it. And it was like, well, and that like narratively, there's more stakes involved if he doesn't have superpowers. You know what I mean? Like, if he's choosing to say incredibly true and revolutionary things and is going to die for them, and he doesn't know that he's going to get like a full reboot when he's done, like if he knows he's coming back like for a couple of hours as a hologram to kind of, say some final goodbyes, that's maybe a bit different. But like if he knows he's coming back physically, it's gonna hurt, but he's gonna be fine afterwards. Like it reduces the stakes. And I can imagine these early Gnostics kind of going like, narratively, I don't think we want to do that. Like
right. Actually sitting down and having the editorial meeting about it.
Like I like your manuscript up to this point, but if you do this, then then it makes us wonder what the rest of it was for. It
negates the whole rest of the story. There's a scholar, he's retired now, his name was Horsley, can't remember his first name, and he had a bit of a revolutionary Jesus that did all these things, not because it was sacred, but because like he had a political agenda and he didn't have the spiritual born again agenda going on. I would check him out if you're interested in that sort of thing. He says some pretty interesting things.
Send it to me,
Jesus
Clark,
and the Empire, I think, or something like text.
Okay, I'll pop it in the show notes. But that does sound super cool.
Okay.
And last thing I'll say too is a quote that we trot out a lot on the show, and that you hear a lot in Gnostic circles. That I'll paraphrase because I never get it quite right, from the Gospel of Philip, which is, people talk about the resurrection, your personal resurrection, that it happens after you die, but you have to be crucified and resurrected while you're still alive. And I think that is what the
Death,
Gnostics really
experiencing
took.
death before you die. Yeah.
Yep, and that's what they took from the story of the death and resurrection of Christ, is that
Yeah.
you actually have to die and be resurrected right here and right now. So it doesn't
And
really
you see
matter
that
about the
multiple times in
physicality
like
of
the
it.
Nag Hammadi. Yeah.
Yeah.
You see it multiple times. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So that was a more important thing for the
Yeah.
Gnostics, and that particular narrative about Jesus.
Mhm.
Okay,
And
we have.
I think that fits in with the Gospel of Mary. Sorry, I got to keep plugging
Oh,
Mary
of course
because
it does.
she's
Please,
my own person.
yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, so we have we're down to our last 10 minutes. Jason, you may not be aware of this, but Clark actually worked in Grant Morrison's The Invisibles into his master's work.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, a question for Clark and Jason from Stuart Johns. Grant Morrison or Alan Moore? Go.
Jeez. Well, I think you know my answer already, Jonathan.
Well, I don't. This is just This is a question from an audience member who doesn't know you.
I respect both of them, but I think I'm much more engaged by Alan Moore.
That's interesting. I feel similarly. I'm a big Alan. I'm a fan of both of them. I discovered Morrison when he was in the middle of him cranking out the Invisibles back in the 90s, and I followed it as closely as I could, buying them when I had the money for it. I really bought into the whole anarcho-Gnostic thing, the conspiracy thing. Like I said, I was into chaos magic and the Temple of Psychic Youth and all that, and it just fit like the world that I found myself in, and it was amazeballs. And then I read a few interviews with him, and he was like, "Guys, don't take this too seriously. You don't want to like actually follow through too much on this. You want capitalism to be around." Like he says things like that, and at which point I was like, "I don't really need you anymore, Morrison."
Yeah.
So
it's possible that something like the Invisibles was like pushed past Morrison's own like internal editor, if that makes sense. Like, because I think the Invisibles is an inspired work, and I think it's inspired people
it is. Yes.
beyond Morrison's intent in a way.
Well, Morrison has basically said that it's a channeled work. Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
Well, but I mean,
he's had some weird experiences writing it, doing it, and putting things into it he had no intention to put into it, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like what I think Morrison for me is kind of like Stan Lee. Like I kind of take everything he says with a bit of a grain of salt, because everything behind it is kind of a little bit of like getting on board the Morrison hype train, you know?
Yeah.
Like he's a showman. He's a pitch man in a way, in a great way, and he's also a great storyteller. But but yeah, like I think in a lot of ways I would see, especially when you're looking at the work he's continued to create since, is like that was a high watermark of inspiration. And I think a lot of everything since has been kind of like playful, engaging,
not as good, but I still buy it. Yeah. Some of the philosophies that we know influence the Invisibles are now kind of considered to be passé or out. Foucault's notion that in order to achieve an actual communist state, we need to go through capitalism, that we will do it through capitalism and not state-sanctioned socialism, which, not to bring up a whole other debate about authoritarian versus non-authoritarian approaches to left-wing goals, but which is another debate that I'll get in with you another time. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I'd love that. That would be great.
And so people don't really take that quite so seriously anymore, I don't think. And then, of course, what's the guy's name? Fukuyama's notion that we reach to the end of history.
Yeah,
that idea is all throughout Morrison's approach to the end of the world. The Fukuyama, and even Fukuyama itself has since, or Fukuyama, I can't remember the dude's name.
I think it's the Yama.
Yeah, it's Fukuyama. He's come out and basically taken that idea back and said, I don't really buy into that anymore. That was a very neoliberal approach to the notion. We figured it all out.
Yeah.
Yes. Very 90s idea. I think no one would look around right now and say, "Oh, history has ended." History is in
We're so
steam.
super smart. Yeah. And of course, we still have to live with the dregs of the overeducated middle class liberal who still thinks that kind of crap.
But there is a thing, like, especially one thing I've always found about the Invisibles, and I think like when you're talking also to like the connection with chaos magic, and again, like I think there's also a lot of like there's a rich vein of ideas in a lot of those places, but especially in the Invisibles, there is almost an enjoyment in reveling in the prison nature. Like I have a prison that I can rebel against. You know what I mean? Like I can be defined by my opposition to this thing. I can be defined by how punk I am through this opposition.
No,
like
that's fair enough.
I think that's a strong theme, because in the end, they kind of go in a monistic direction, right? That is that. I don't know if he started off like Morrison is more of an intuitive writer than Moore, right? And that is one of the main complaints about Moore is that he's very clinical. Everything is set up very tightly, and it can feel a little bit soulless. But that this is coming from the world's biggest Alan Moore fan. But I do think that
hold on.
No, second biggest. And I do think that there is there is some truth to that. Where Morrison does, he does seed a lot. Like he does set up like some interesting structures and parallels, and he is a good writer, and he does have things that pay off later. But he is a little bit more intuitive than Moore, right? He will go off in a direction, and I don't think that's what he started out doing with the Invisibles. But by the end, he does sort of explore that theme of being defined by your opposition and going in a more monistic, less dualist fashion.
And you mean in attempting to transcend being defined by your opposition, to transcend that notion? Yeah, is that what you're saying? Yeah, okay, I agree with that. Yes, that makes sense. Because the notion of foreground and background is all throughout the Invisibles and a couple of his other works since then, for sure. The Moore, on the other hand, is just about break everything. I'm a big fan of fire. I like explosions, and I agree with break everything. I don't know that I've really noticed. I mean, he does have a very technical approach. Like his historical details are minute. And when I live in Boston, and I was reading Providence, and I was like sitting there going, I was going to the locations that show up in the book because I live in Boston, and I can do that. Yeah. And it was a very awesome magical / postmodern approach. And he got a lot of the drawing details spot on.
Yeah,
like you can do it on the map application on your phone, or you can just go there and look at it if you live in Boston. I work right down the street from like the police riot that he was talking about. It's awesome.
And I think actually
that was very magical.
Yeah. Well. And this is the thing actually that I'm really jazzing on in terms of what you're saying, and maybe again that connection of why I lean more towards Moore is because I can take the magical work that Moore is making, and I can internalize it in a way that I don't need to be like. I think like the Invisibles works if you're Grant Morrison, like
right.
Whereas I can take what Alan Moore writes magically and incorporate it more fully into my I don't need to become a Scottish punk, right. Which is, I mean, and also like Grant Morrison's other work, like say he's been writing a lot for DC Comics lately. Like I don't need to be a Scottish punk to enjoy his Batman as much as I not that I need it to enjoy the Invisibles, but the Invisibles is just like, as you say, it's so much of its specific time and creation, and I think there's so much value there. Like I don't want to sound like I'm just shitting on it because I'm not.
Right.
But it's like it feels so much more like it's a launching pad towards other sources, and I think the risk is that you can read the Invisibles and think that you're done.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And then
okay,
you skip
nerds.
the scope, which you shouldn't do.
Yeah.
Nerds, I want to nerd out all night long, but we are actually at our time. So we will pick this up in the future, I promise. I actually did, and honestly, I did not write all these questions. They are authentic questions from viewers and listeners, but I snuck in a few. I did put one in about politics. Clark, we'll come back to it in a future show. I'll call that show a communist, a social democrat, and an anarchist walk into a bar, or perhaps walk into a Gnostic church, and we'll take it from there. Before we depart, Clark is an incredibly private person. Please don't bother him or find him or show up at his doorstep to fist fight him.
Because you will lose. I actually can fight. You will lose.
See, exactly. So don't humiliate yourself like that. However, Jason, you run a theater company.
I do, yeah. Sage Theatre, we're a local theatre company here in Calgary. Been around for about 20 years now, and without, I mean, like, I do not prescribe a Gnostic interpretation on the work that we make, but a big thing that I've been focusing on is work that promotes empathy and community with Sage Theatre, and I think there's a quality of Gnosis that may happen without it being a dogmatic, specific process, if that makes sense.
It sure does.
In the kind of theater work that I make. And then if you want to find me anywhere else, it's just jasonmehmel.com.
Fantastic. Cool. And Clark, well, what I will do is link your previous show about the Gospel of Mary so everybody can enjoy that. They can hear more about the Invisible, so they can hear more about the Gospel of Mary and get some more great talk Gnosis. So we got to go, folks. It's been awesome. There are a few questions we didn't get to. We'll get to them next time. Clark and Jason, thanks so much for joining me sort of at the last moment, but it's been an incredibly rad show. To everybody out there, I love you. I'm your best friend. Remember to go to patreon.com/Gnostic. Please share the show. And good night, good luck, Godspeed, farewell.
Night.
Bye, everybody.
Rock and roll. See ya.
Bye.